They say inheritance is about more than money. But in the winter of 1887, when a young woman stood in a lawyer's office and learned her wealthy father had left her absolutely nothing, while her cruel stepmother claimed everything, she discovered that some legacies are written in secrets rather than gold. Caroline Bennett watched her stepmother Victoria laugh with triumph as the will was read, mocking her for being foolish enough to believe her father loved her, and she felt something inside her die from the shame and rejection. What neither woman knew as they left that office was that Caroline's father had indeed left her something so valuable and dangerous that he'd hidden it from everyone, including the lawyers, and that the mountain man who'd been watching from the shadows would soon reveal a truth that would turn everything upside down. This is the story of an inheritance that looked like nothing but was actually everything, of a father's love that survived death through carefully laid plans, and of a mysterious stranger from the mountains who held the key to secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried. Caroline had never been close to her stepmother, but she'd always believed her father loved her, despite his cold exterior and infrequent displays of affection. William Bennett had been a successful mine owner and land speculator who'd married Victoria 3 years after Caroline's mother died, and the new Mrs. Bennett had made it clear from day one that Caroline was an inconvenience she tolerated only for her husband's sake. When William died suddenly of a heart attack at age 52, Caroline had grieved genuinely, while Victoria had grieved theatrically, and Caroline had tried not to judge because everyone mourned differently. The reading of the will had been scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral, and Caroline had arrived at the lawyer's office with modest expectations, hoping perhaps for a small inheritance that would let her start a life independent of Victoria's cruelty. Instead, she'd listened in growing horror as the lawyer read through provisions that left everything to Victoria. The house, the mining interests, the land holdings, the bank accounts, all of it went to the widow, with no provision for the daughter, beyond a recommendation that Victoria provide for Caroline's welfare until she married. The lawyer had looked uncomfortable delivering this news, and Victoria had looked triumphant in a way that made Caroline's stomach turn. "I'm so sorry, my dear," Victoria had said with false sympathy that didn't match her gleaming eyes. "Your father must have felt you'd be adequately cared for through my generosity. Of course, you're welcome to continue living in the house, as long as you make yourself useful, and don't cause trouble." Caroline had stood there with her father's betrayal crushing her chest, trying to understand how the man who'd raised her could leave her completely dependent on a woman who despised her. The lawyer had cleared his throat, and mentioned something about a sealed letter addressed to Caroline that William had left, with instructions it only be opened if certain conditions were met, but Victoria had snatched it away, claiming that as the primary beneficiary, she had the right to examine all documents first. She'd read the letter quickly, her face going through expressions Caroline couldn't interpret, then laughed dismissively. "It's nothing, just your father's rambling about responsibility and character. Typical William, always more concerned with philosophy than practical matters. You may have it if you want, though it won't buy you anything." She'd thrust the letter at Caroline, and swept out of the office, and Caroline had been left standing there with a piece of paper covered in her father's distinctive handwriting, and a heart so broken she could barely breathe. She'd walked home in a daze, climbed the stairs to her small room in the house that was no longer hers, and finally read the letter her father had left. The words made no immediate sense, written in the deliberately vague language of someone who expected the letter might be read by unintended eyes. He wrote about loving her more than she knew, about teaching her to be strong and independent, about how the most valuable things in life were often invisible to those who only saw worth in gold and land. He mentioned their fishing trips to Crystal Lake when she was young, how she'd always been able to find the best spots, and how some treasures required knowing where to look and having the courage to claim them. Caroline read the letter 3 times, trying to find some hidden message or instruction, but it seemed exactly what Victoria had called it, philosophical rambling from a man facing mortality. She was crying into her pillow that night, mourning both her father and her future, when she heard a sound at her window that made her freeze in terror. Someone was outside, and they were trying to get her attention with small pebbles thrown against the glass. Caroline crept to the window and peered out into the darkness, and what she saw made her heart stammer with confusion and fear. A man stood in the garden below, tall and rough-looking in mountain clothes, with a face half hidden by a beard, and a hat pulled low. He gestured urgently for her to come down, and when Caroline hesitated, he held up something that glinted in the moonlight. Her father's pocket watch, the one William had always carried, the one that should have been buried with him. Caroline's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. This man had somehow obtained her father's watch, which meant he was either a grave robber, or had taken it before William's burial, or had been given it for reasons Caroline couldn't fathom. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore him, to call for help, to stay safe in her room. But something about the way he held that watch, something about the urgency in his gesture, made Caroline grab a shawl and creep downstairs. She slipped out the back door and found the man waiting in the shadows of the garden wall, and up close he was even more intimidating than she'd thought. He was huge, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical labor, and his eyes in the moonlight were a startling blue that seemed to see straight through her. "Miss Bennett, I'm sorry to frighten you, but I couldn't risk coming to the door where your stepmother might see. My name is Jacob Thornton, and I worked for your father in ways that weren't part of any official record. He sent me to find you if anything happened to him, told me to wait until after the will was read and then make contact. He knew Victoria would get everything in the official will, but that was deliberate. Your real inheritance isn't in any lawyer's office. It's hidden where only someone with your father's letter, and my knowledge, can find it." He held out the pocket watch and Caroline took it with trembling hands. "Your father loved you more than his own life, Miss Bennett. Everything he did in these last 2 years was to protect you and set you up for a future Victoria couldn't touch. But we need to move fast because there are men who suspect William hid something valuable, and they're watching this house waiting to see if anyone comes looking for his daughter." Caroline's thoughts spun in dizzy circles. "I don't understand. What inheritance? What men? Why would my father create this elaborate deception, instead of just providing for me properly in his will?" Jacob glanced around nervously, clearly worried about being seen. "Because your father discovered something during his mining operations, something so valuable that when certain people found out about it, they had him killed. The heart attack wasn't natural, Miss Bennett. William was murdered, poisoned slowly over months, and he knew it was happening, but couldn't prove it, or stop it. So instead, he made arrangements. He changed his will to give Victoria everything worthless, while hiding the real treasure, where only you could claim it. He left you that letter with clues, and he hired me to make sure you understood, and could get safely to what he'd hidden. But we have to go now, tonight, before Victoria realizes the letter contained actual information, and before the men who killed your father figure out where to look." The words hit Caroline like physical blows. Her father murdered, poisoned, dying slowly, while trying to protect her from killers who wanted whatever he'd found. The grief and betrayal she'd been feeling transformed into rage and determination. "Tell me what to do. Tell me how to claim what my father wanted me to have." Jacob nodded with grim approval. "Pack light and warm. We're going into the mountains to Crystal Lake, to the place your father taught you to fish. He left something there for you, something that will make you wealthier than Victoria could dream. But Miss Bennett, once we leave, there's no coming back easily. The men hunting for this will follow, and we'll have to be ready to fight or run. Your life is about to get dangerous in ways a young lady shouldn't have to face. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Caroline thought about Victoria's cruel laughter, about her father's supposed betrayal that now revealed itself as protection, about the life of dependence and humiliation that awaited her if she stayed. "I'm ready. Give me 10 minutes to pack, and I'll meet you by the back gate." She crept back inside and gathered what she'd need, including the money she'd saved from her modest allowance, a warm coat, and her mother's jewelry that Victoria hadn't yet claimed. She changed into riding clothes, and wrote a brief note, saying she'd left to stay with a friend, knowing it would buy them a few hours before Victoria raised an alarm. Then she slipped out into the night where Jacob waited with 2 horses, and together they rode into darkness toward mountains that held either salvation or destruction. The journey to Crystal Lake took 2 days of hard riding through country that got progressively more remote and dangerous. Jacob proved to be a skilled guide, and surprisingly good company, despite his rough appearance. And during the long hours in the saddle, Caroline learned more about her father's last years than she'd known while he lived. Jacob explained that he'd been a prospector who'd worked claims adjacent to William's mining operations, and that one day William had approached him with an unusual proposition. He'd found something remarkable, Jacob said, not gold or silver but something else, something that certain powerful men wanted desperately. William needed someone trustworthy to help him hide this discovery and protect it until the time was right to reveal it. He'd paid Jacob well for his help and his silence, and made him promise that if anything happened to William, Jacob would make sure Caroline received her true inheritance. "What did my father find?" Caroline asked as they made camp the second night, and Jacob looked at her across the fire with an expression that was part admiration and part worry. "Your father found proof, Miss Bennett. Documentary evidence that a group of territorial officials have been systematically stealing from the government, embezzling funds meant for Indian reservations and infrastructure projects. He found ledgers showing payments, letters arranging bribes, even a confession from one participant who'd grown a conscience. It's enough to bring down governors and senators, to send wealthy and powerful men to prison for decades. That's why they killed him, and that's why they'll kill you if they realize you know where that evidence is hidden." Caroline felt her world reshape around this revelation. Her father hadn't been just a businessman, but apparently some kind of crusader for justice, gathering evidence against corruption at the cost of his own life. Why didn't he just turn this evidence over to authorities? Why hide it and die for it? Jacob poked at the fire with a stick, his expression grim. Because the authorities are part of the corruption, or at least enough of them are that William couldn't know who to trust. He was working with a federal investigator, someone sent from Washington specifically to look into territorial corruption, but that investigator was killed in what was ruled an accident before William could hand over the evidence. After that, William knew he was being watched, and that anyone he approached might be compromised. So he decided to hide everything and wait for the right moment. But the killers got impatient and poisoned him before he could execute his full plan. That's where you come in, Miss Bennett. You're meant to finish what your father started, take that evidence to people who can't be bought, and make sure the men who killed him face justice. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Caroline's shoulders like a physical burden. Her father hadn't just left her an inheritance, he'd left her a mission. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I can't do what he wanted? Jacob met her eyes across the flames. Your father believed you were the strongest person he knew. He told me once that you had your mother's courage and his stubbornness, and that combination would see you through anything. He chose you for this, Miss Bennett, not because you were convenient, but because he trusted you completely. Now we just have to get to Crystal Lake, retrieve what he hid, and get you safely to the federal marshal's office in Denver. They reached Crystal Lake on the third day, and Caroline felt a rush of memory seeing the crystal-clear water surrounded by pine trees and granite cliffs. She'd come here as a child with her father, spending summer days fishing and talking, and some of her happiest memories were tied to this place. Jacob led her to the spot where William had taught her to fish, a particular outcropping of rock on the eastern shore, and pointed to the water. Your father wrote in his letter about you always finding the best fishing spots. There's a waterproof case weighted with rocks about 6 feet down, right at the base of that outcropping. He anchored it so it wouldn't drift, and he knew this lake well enough to know where to place it so it wouldn't be visible from shore, but would be reachable by someone who knew exactly where to look. Caroline stared at the water, understanding finally what her father's letter had been telling her. The best spot, the place she'd always gone as a child, was also the hiding place for evidence that would bring down corrupt officials and avenge William's murder. She stripped off her boots and coat, ignoring Jacob's startled protest, and waded into water so cold it stole her breath. She dove down, groping along the rocky bottom, and on her second try, her hands closed around a metal case secured with chains. She dragged it up, gasping and shivering, and Jacob was there to help her onto shore and wrap her in a blanket. The case was locked with a combination mechanism, and Caroline was turning it hopelessly when she realized the numbers on her father's pocket watch, the birth date of her mother, would be the combination. She tried it, and the case clicked open, revealing bundles of documents wrapped in oiled cloth. Caroline unfolded one bundle and saw her father's handwriting covering pages of careful notes, names and dates and amounts, alongside official documents that looked damning even to her untrained eye. This was what her father had died protecting, what powerful men had killed to keep secret, what Victoria had dismissed as nothing because she'd never understood that some inheritances couldn't be measured in property or gold. Caroline was rewrapping the documents when she heard Jacob curse under his breath. She looked up to see 5 men on horseback emerging from the tree line, and the way they moved spoke of violence and bad intentions. "We've been followed," Jacob said quietly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "They must have had watchers on the house who saw us leave. Miss Bennett, I need you to run now. Take the case and head north toward the mining camp about 10 miles from here. There are people there who knew your father and will help you get to Denver. I'll hold these men off as long as I can." Caroline felt panic rise in her throat but pushed it down. "I'm not leaving you to die alone. We'll fight together or run together, but I'm not abandoning someone who's helped me." Jacob's expression softened. "Your father said you were stubborn." "All right then. We'll try to talk our way out first, and fight only if we must. Stay behind me and don't speak unless I signal you." The riders approached slowly, and Caroline recognized the man in front as Marcus Welsh, a business associate of her father's who'd visited the house several times. He smiled when he saw her, and it was the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "Miss Bennett, what a surprise finding you out here so far from home. And with William's pet prospector too. I suppose that means you've found what we've been looking for." Marcus gestured to his companions, hard-faced men with guns drawn. "Your father was a fool to think he could threaten us with his evidence and investigation. We gave him chances to back off, to take a generous payment for his silence. But William always did have an overdeveloped sense of righteousness. So we poisoned him slowly enough that it looked natural, and we'd been waiting to see if he'd left instructions for anyone to retrieve his precious documents. Looks like he chose his daughter as his messenger. How touching." Caroline felt hatred burn hot in her chest. This man had killed her father, had poisoned him over months while pretending friendship and business partnership. "You'll hang for what you've done, all of you. This evidence will destroy your careers and send you to prison, and I'll make sure of it if it's the last thing I do." Marcus laughed. Brave words from a girl with no weapons facing 5 armed men. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over that case and every document inside. Then you're going to die tragically in an accident, maybe a fall from these cliffs, or a drowning in the lake. Jacob there will share your fate, and the evidence that never existed will stay buried forever. Your stepmother will mourn publicly, while celebrating privately that the inconvenient stepdaughter is no longer a problem." Jacob's gun cleared its holster so fast Caroline barely saw him move. "Or you could turn around and ride away while you still can, Marcus. I'm not some soft businessman you can intimidate. I survived 2 years in the mountains during the gold rush, killed men who tried to steal my claims, and I promised William Bennett I'd protect his daughter with my life. You want this evidence, you'll have to go through me, and I promise you at least 3 of you will die before I go down. Is it worth it? Is keeping your corruption secret worth dying here in the wilderness?" The standoff stretched out while Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs. She could see Marcus calculating odds and risks, weighing his options against potential consequences. Finally, he smiled again, and this time it was genuine amusement. "You're bluffing, Thornton. You might get 1 or 2 of us, but you'll be dead before you empty that gun, and the girl will be defenseless. So let's stop playing games and hand over the case." What happened next moved so fast that Caroline could barely process it. Jacob fired once, hitting the man closest to Marcus, then dove sideways as return fire tore through the space where he'd been standing. Caroline grabbed the case and ran for the trees like Jacob had instructed, her feet flying over rough ground while bullets chewed bark around her. She heard more shots behind her, and Jacob's voice shouting for her to keep running, and then she was in the forest with branches whipping her face and terror driving her forward. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, and when she finally collapsed behind a fallen log, she realized she could still hear gunfire echoing from the lake. Jacob was still fighting, still buying her time to escape, and Caroline felt tears streaming down her face because she knew what that meant. He was going to die protecting her, fulfilling the promise he'd made to her father, and she would carry that weight forever. She wanted to go back, to help him somehow, but she knew that would make his sacrifice meaningless. So instead she clutched the case containing her father's evidence, and started moving north toward the mining camp Jacob had mentioned, forcing herself to keep going, even when every instinct screamed to turn back. The next 12 hours were a nightmare of flight through hostile wilderness. Caroline was exhausted, terrified, and alone with evidence that men had killed for, and would kill for, again. She stumbled into the mining camp just after dawn, barely coherent, and was taken in by miners who'd known her father. They gave her food and shelter and listened to her story. And when she finished, they formed an armed escort to take her to Denver. The journey took a week, But they made it safely, and Caroline delivered her father's evidence to federal marshals who'd come from Washington specifically to investigate territorial corruption. The trials that followed became the biggest scandal in frontier history. Governors resigned, senators were imprisoned, and Caroline's testimony about her father's murder led to convictions for Marcus Welch and his co-conspirators. Victoria was exposed as having known about the murder plot, and was stripped of the inheritance she'd celebrated, which reverted to Caroline as William's rightful heir. Caroline inherited everything her father had built, along with the knowledge that he'd loved her enough to die, protecting not just her financial future, but her moral inheritance as well. But the real revelation came 3 months after she'd reached Denver, when a scarred and limping Jacob Thornton appeared at her door. He'd survived the gunfight at Crystal Lake, killing 2 of Marcus's men, and escaping into the mountains where he'd hidden, until the danger passed. His return meant everything to Caroline, this mountain man who'd kept his promise to her father, and nearly died doing it. Over the following months, as Caroline rebuilt her life and managed her inheritance, she and Jacob grew close in ways that surprised them both. The rough prospector and the wealthy heiress seemed like an unlikely match, but they'd survived something extraordinary together, and formed bonds that couldn't be broken by social convention. 2 years after that terrible day when Caroline had stood in the lawyer's office believing her father had abandoned her, she stood in a church preparing to marry Jacob Thornton with a congregation full of friends who'd stood by her through the trials. Victoria had disappeared somewhere back east, her reputation destroyed, and Caroline had transformed her father's business empire into something that honored his memory and values. She'd established scholarships for young women, funded hospitals and schools, and used her wealth to continue her father's fight against corruption and injustice. As she walked down the aisle toward Jacob, Caroline thought about the inheritance her stepmother had laughed at, the nothing that had turned out to be everything. Her father had left her courage and purpose, and a mission that had shaped her into someone stronger than she'd ever imagined she could be. He'd left her proof that love could survive death through carefully laid plans and the loyalty of rough mountain men who kept their promises. He'd left her not just wealth, but the knowledge that true inheritance is measured in character and conviction, rather than gold and property. Jacob took her hand at the altar with the same steady strength he'd shown that night in the garden when he'd first appeared with her father's watch. They'd both been changed by their journey to Crystal Lake and what had followed, shaped by violence and loss, and the discovery that sometimes the people who seem to have nothing are really the richest of all. Victoria had inherited a fortune in land and mines, but Caroline had inherited something far more valuable, a father's love that had reached beyond death to guide her, a protector who'd risked everything to keep a promise, and a strength she'd never known she possessed until testing forced it to the surface. The inheritance that had looked like nothing became the foundation of a legacy that lasted generations. Caroline and Jacob raised their children on stories of courage and sacrifice, of the grandfather who'd died protecting truth, and the mountain man who'd honored his word, at nearly fatal cost. The Bennett fortune continued to grow under Caroline's wise management, but what people remembered wasn't her wealth but her character, her commitment to justice, and her refusal to let her father's murder go unavenged, or his values be forgotten. Victoria had laughed when Caroline inherited nothing from the official will, never imagining that the real inheritance was hidden, where only love and trust could reveal it. She'd celebrated her victory while actually losing everything that mattered, while Caroline had grieved her loss only to discover she'd been given everything she needed. The mountain man who'd appeared in the garden had been the key to unlocking a father's final gift, and that gift had been far more than documents or evidence or even wealth. It had been the knowledge that she was loved beyond measure, trusted completely, and capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. As Caroline and Jacob left the church hand in hand, ready to build their future together, she touched the pocket watch she wore on a chain around her neck, the one her father had given Jacob to prove his identity and purpose. Inside was a photograph of William Bennett, smiling at the camera with young Caroline on his lap, a memory of love that had survived death and betrayal, and years of doubt. Her stepmother had laughed at her inheritance of nothing, never understanding that sometimes nothing is really everything disguised, waiting for someone brave enough and loved enough to claim it. And Caroline had claimed it all, had fought for it and earned it and transformed it into a legacy her father would have been proud of. Proof that the best inheritances can't be read in wills or counted in gold, but must be discovered through courage, and carried forward through love.